The Montana sun beat down on the weathered porch of the Hayes Ranch, bleaching the wooden planks to a pale, splintery gray. Dust devils danced across the parched fields in the distance, a restless energy in an otherwise still and suffocating afternoon. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of desperation and the sharp, dry scent of dying grass. On one side of the porch stood Charles Hayes, a man whose shoulders seemed to carry the burden of every failed crop and unpaid loan. His frame stooped with a shame that was almost palpable. Opposite him, William Blackwood stood tall and unyielding, a figure carved from the very rock and shadow of the surrounding mountains. His presence alone seemed to drain the color from the landscape, his silence a more potent force than any threat. The final words of the agreement were spoken not with ceremony, but with the grim finality of a foreclosure notice. A single, firm handshake sealed the pact. For Charles, it was the end of a crushing debt. For William, it was a simple acquisition, another asset added to his vast portfolio. Standing by the screen door, slightly removed from the transaction, was Eleanor Hayes. Ellie watched her future being bartered away with a stillness that defied her circumstances. Dressed in a simple cotton dress that had seen better days, she was not the picture of a blushing bride, but of quiet dignity. Her whiskey-colored eyes, clear and intelligent, missed nothing. They registered her father's averted gaze and the cold indifference in William Blackwood's face as he acquired her. A man known throughout the county only as the Vulture. William gave a curt nod. The deal concluded in his mind. He turned, his worn leather boots scuffing against the porch boards. Ready to depart as if he had just purchased a head of cattle. The tension should have broken then, but instead it coiled tighter when a soft but firm voice cut through the heavy air. "Mr. Blackwood." He stopped, his back still to them. No one spoke his name without a tremor of fear or a tone of fawning respect. He turned slowly, his expression a mask of cold inquiry, to find Ellie had stepped forward. She met his gaze directly, without flinching. A flicker of defiance in her otherwise calm demeanor. "I will be your wife," she stated, her voice even and clear, "but I will not be your property. I expect you to know the difference." The words hung in the oppressive heat, an act of audacity so profound it left both older men speechless. Charles Hayes paled, expecting an explosion of rage from the man who held his life in his hands. But William Blackwood did not erupt. Instead, for the briefest of moments, the hard lines around his eyes softened with something akin to surprise. A crack appeared in the stone facade. He held her gaze for a long, silent beat, his mind processing the woman who stood before him, not as collateral, but as a challenge. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked toward his truck without another word. It's in moments of such quiet courage, when one person refuses to be broken, that you see the true beginning of a story. If these are the kinds of stories that matter to you, subscribing is the best way to help us keep bringing them to light. The drive to Blackwood Ridge Ranch was a silent, tense journey through a landscape as unforgiving as the man sitting beside her. The truck kicked up a plume of dust that followed them like a ghost. When they arrived, the house rose from the land not as a home, but as a fortress of dark timber and cold, grey stone. It was immense, impeccably maintained, yet it possessed a profound and unnerving silence. As Ellie stepped out of the truck, the heavy oak door swung open on its own, revealing a cavernous entryway where the air was still and cool, smelling faintly of old wood and something else she couldn't place. Loneliness. Her own footsteps echoed on the polished floor, the only sound in a house that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a life that had long since departed. In the first few days, William was a phantom in his own home. He moved with a heavy, deliberate tread, his presence announced by the creak of a floorboard or the distant clink of a glass. He treated her with a cold, formal distance, a landlord showing a tenant their new, unadorned room. He expected fear, or perhaps tears, but Ellie gave him neither. Instead, she moved through the silent halls with a quiet curiosity. She didn't rearrange his life or intrude upon his solitude. She simply existed within it, bringing small, almost imperceptible changes. She found a wilting plant on a windowsill and began to nurse it back to health. She would sit in the grand library, not reading his books, but simply absorbing the profound quiet, her stillness a gentle counterpoint to his restless, brooding energy. Her quiet exploration eventually led her to a single locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was no different from the others, made of the same dark, heavy wood, but it felt sealed, a place where secrets were kept. She felt a pull toward it, not of nosy curiosity, but of a deeper, more empathetic wonder. She could have ignored it, could have accepted it as another boundary in this house of walls, but that wasn't her way. One evening, as William sat staring into a fire that offered little warmth, she approached him. She didn't demand or pry. She simply asked, her voice soft but clear. "The room at the end of the hall. It's locked. I was just wondering about it." The directness of the question was like a stone tossed into a still, dark pond. William's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing under his weathered skin. He was accustomed to people who skirted around him, who spoke in hushed tones and feared his reactions. Her simple, unafraid question was a violation of the unspoken rules of his world. He turned his head slowly, his eyes like chips of flint. "And it was my son's room," he said, the words clipped and harsh, each one a shard of glass meant to cut her, to push her away. He wanted her to retreat, to be intimidated by the raw pain he wielded as a shield. He expected her to offer some empty, placating apology, the kind of useless pity he had come to despise. He was daring her to feel sorry for him, so he could have a reason to unleash the cold fury that was always simmering just beneath the surface. But Ellie did not recoil. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. She simply held his gaze, her own whiskey-colored eyes filled not with sorrow for him, but with a deep, quiet understanding of loss itself. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of his pain that asked for nothing in return. In that moment, she was not the girl who had been sold to him, nor the woman living in his house. She was simply another human being, recognizing the wound in another. For William, this was more disarming than any argument or display of fear. He saw in her a strength that didn't challenge his power, but simply refused to be broken by his pain, and a crack formed in the icy wall around his heart. The external world, however, was not as compassionate. Their first trip into the small town of Jasper Creek was an exercise in public humiliation. As they walked down the main street to the general store, conversations would halt, heads would turn, and whispers would follow them like a swarm of biting flies. Ellie could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, labeling her. They saw her simple dress and the powerful, feared man at her side, and they drew their own conclusions. They called her a gold digger with their stares, a foolish girl who had traded her life for security. She kept her head held high, her posture straight. But inside, each whispered comment was a small, sharp sting, a reminder that she was an outcast in her own community. It takes a special kind of courage to face down the judgment of an entire town, to hold on to your dignity when everyone is trying to strip it away. You see that same strength in people every day, fighting silent battles that no one else understands. Sharing these stories of quiet resilience is so important, and it's only possible because of the support from people like you who subscribe and help us keep these voices heard. Ellie walked through the gauntlet of stairs, her quiet grace her only armor, knowing that her truth was something they would never be able to see, let alone comprehend. She was not a victim in this story. She was a survivor, learning the true cost of her father's desperate bargain. A week later, a ferocious thunderstorm descended upon the valley. a violent outburst of nature that seemed to echo the turmoil inside the stone house. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rattled the very foundations of the ranch. Deep in the night, William was thrown from his sleep by a nightmare, the same one that had haunted him for years. He was back on that slick, rain-swept road, seeing the headlights, hearing the terrible screech of metal, the shattering glass, and then the awful, deafening silence that followed. He woke up gasping, his heart pounding against his ribs, the ghosts of his wife and son filling the darkness of his room. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging within him. He stumbled out into the hallway, his mind a chaotic whirl of grief and old terror, needing to escape the confines of the room. And there he saw her. Ellie was sitting in a large armchair at the far end of the hall, a book lying open in her lap. Bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. She hadn't been sleeping. It was as if she had been standing watch, a silent guardian against the night. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't ask if he was all right, didn't mention the choked sounds that must have come from his room. She simply rose, went to a small side table, and returned with a glass of water, which she offered to him without a word. In that simple, unspoken gesture, William felt something shift inside him, a profound and fundamental change. Her quiet presence was not an intrusion. It was a comfort, a balm to a wound he thought would never heal. She wasn't trying to fix him or save him. She was just there, offering a glass of water to a man drowning in his own memories. He took the glass, his calloused, trembling fingers brushing against hers, and in that brief contact, he felt a flicker of warmth, of life. He realized then that her presence in his house was not the closing of a deal, but the opening of a door he had long ago bolted shut. He had brought her here as an asset, but she was becoming his anchor. This is how healing often begins, not with grand declarations, but with a small, unexpected act of kindness that finds its way through the cracks of a broken heart. A single moment of human connection can illuminate the darkest of paths. If you believe in the power of these quiet, transformative moments, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is what allows us to continue sharing stories that remind us of the profound strength and compassion we are all capable of. William stood there in the dimly lit hallway, the storm raging outside, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel entirely alone in his pain. The fragile peace, however, was soon threatened by the past. Charles Hayes, having heard whispers in town of his daughter's calming effect on the formidable William Blackwood, saw not a happy outcome, but a new opportunity for exploitation. He arrived at the ranch unannounced one afternoon, his hat in his hands, but his eyes gleaming with a familiar greed. He spoke to William not as a father-in-law, but as a business associate looking to renegotiate. He spoke of new debts, of poor crop yields, and hinted that a little more financial help would ensure his daughter's continued happiness. The request was a slap in the face, a crass attempt to monetize Ellie's quiet dignity and the tentative bond she was forming with William. William watched the exchange, his expression unreadable, a storm gathering behind his eyes. He saw the greed in Charles's face, the same desperate weakness he'd seen on the porch that first day, but now it was twisted into something far uglier. He saw a man willing to pimp out his daughter's newfound peace for another handout. Before William could speak, Ellie stepped forward from the doorway where she had been listening. She looked not at William, but at her father, her whiskey-colored eyes holding no anger, only a profound and weary disappointment. "That's enough, Father," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the finality of a closing door. "You've taken enough. This is my home now." "You are no longer welcome here," Charles stammered, his opportunistic smile faltering, but he saw the steel in his daughter's spine and the thunder in William's silence. He left without another word. The annual Founders' Day festival was a kaleidoscope of bright dresses, sizzling barbecue, and the cheerful sounds of a local band playing slightly off-key. It was the heart of Jasper Creek's social calendar, and for the first time, William and Ellie attended together. They moved through the crowds, a strange and compelling couple, the feared rancher and his quiet, dignified wife. For a few hours, the whispers seemed to soften, replaced by hesitant nods and even a few shy smiles. A fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over Ellie, a feeling that perhaps they could build a life here, beyond the shadows of their beginning. But the past was not so easily buried, and it was waiting for them near the beer tent. Holding a half-empty bottle and a festering sense of entitlement, Charles Hayes, his face flushed with drink and self-pity, was holding court with a group of other ranchers. His voice, loud and slurring, cut through the festive noise. "Blackwood thinks he's a king," he boasted, "but even a king has to pay his dues." A man beside him snickered, goading him on. "Paid a steep price for that girl of yours, didn't he?" Charles swelled with a drunkard's pride. $500,000, he declared, the number hanging in the air like a foul smell. "That's what my daughter is worth. Sold her fair and square." The words travelled, a ripple of poison spreading through the crowd. Ellie heard them, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every eye in the town square turned to her, their gazes a mixture of pity and cruel validation. She was no longer a woman. She was a price tag. In that moment, William saw not just her humiliation, but the full weight of the injustice she had carried since the day he'd shaken her father's hand. A cold, precise anger, unlike any rage he had ever felt, settled deep in his bones. He didn't lash out. He simply moved. With deliberate, unwavering steps, he walked toward the town gazebo, his presence silencing the band and drawing every gaze. He stepped onto the raised platform, a solitary, imposing figure against the blue Montana sky. He looked at Charles Hayes, whose drunken bravado evaporated into pure terror. Then his eyes found Ellie, and in his gaze was a lifetime of apology. His voice, clear and strong, carried across the silent square. "The debt is forgiven, Charles," he stated, "but what you have done to your daughter is unforgivable." He then turned his full attention to Ellie, speaking to her as if they were the only two people in the world. "They think I bought you," he said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability no one had ever witnessed. "The truth is, you rescued me. You walked into my silent house and brought back the light. You rescued me from myself." He stepped down from the gazebo and walked toward her, stopping just before her. "Our marriage began as a contract, an insult to the woman you are. I am asking now, Eleanor, in front of everyone, if you will do me the honor of being my wife. My real wife, not by my will or your father's, but by your own." He stood before her, not as the vulture, but as a man laid bare, offering not a fortune, but a heart he had thought was long dead. A hush fell over the town square, so profound that the rustle of the cottonwood leaves was the only sound. Ellie looked at the man before her, his vulnerability a raw, open wound for all to see. Tears welled in her whiskey-colored eyes, not of humiliation, but of a deep, soul-shaking recognition. She saw the end of his loneliness and the beginning of their truth. She took a step forward, closing the small distance between them, and gently placed her hand on his cheek. In a voice just loud enough for the silent crowd to hear, she whispered, "Yes." It was not a word of acceptance, but of affirmation. He was not the vulture, and she was not his property. They were two broken souls who had found a way to be whole together. The kiss they shared was not one of passion, but of quiet promise, sealing a vow made not of debt, but of a love forged in the fires of shared pain and redemption. In the months that followed, Blackwood Ridge Ranch underwent a transformation as profound as its owners. The silent, imposing house of stone and dark timber began to breathe again. Windows were thrown open to let in the Montana sunshine, and the echoes of loneliness were replaced by the sounds of life. William, with Ellie as his partner and conscience, became a different kind of landowner. He raised wages for his ranch hands, built new, comfortable housing for their families, and started a scholarship fund for their children. The fear he once commanded was replaced by a fierce and abiding loyalty. He was no longer a vulture circling over the valley, but a guardian, using his power not to acquire, but to nurture the community that had once judged him so harshly. His strength was no longer measured by the vastness of his land, but by the well-being of the people who lived on it. Their greatest project, however, was born from William's oldest wound. Together, they established the Sarah Blackwood Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing financial aid and resources to struggling farming families across the state, ensuring no father would ever be desperate enough to make the kind of bargain Charles Hayes had made. The locked room at the end of the hall was finally opened, not to erase the memory of his first wife and son, but to honor them. It became the Foundation's office, a place where their tragic loss was transformed into a legacy of hope and support for others. Seeing a man turn his deepest pain into a source of healing for an entire community is a powerful reminder of the human spirit's capacity for good. It is a privilege to share these journeys of redemption, and your subscription is what makes it possible for us to continue finding and telling them. 5 years later, the weathered porch of the Blackwood Ranch was no longer a place of grim transactions, but one of joyful chaos. A small boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's whiskey-colored eyes chased a laughing golden retriever across the lawn, his shrieks of delight echoing in the warm afternoon air. Ellie sat in a rocking chair, a gentle smile on her face. As William came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, he was a different man now. The hard lines on his face had been softened by years of laughter, the coldness in his eyes replaced by a deep and steady warmth. He was no longer the silent, brooding figure who haunted his own home, but a husband and father who had found a peace that all his wealth could never buy. He had learned that true strength was not in being feared, but in the quiet courage it takes to love and be loved in return.